making Waffle, it's been about 3 weeks since the last one, and the reason for that is I ended up getting a cold about 2 days after, and it's floored me for a few weeks, so the 512 subscriber special's a little bit late, but you know, better late than never. So I'll start this with a pickup, following on from the intro, and I'll show you what I've picked up. Okay, so this is my pickup. He's a cat who wants it still, so I think that it's either the light or the camera or something he doesn't like. Animals will do what they please. We got him from a rescue centre, so in this case it was a pickup where the cat chose us rather than us choosing the cat, and yeah, he's been really good. His name's Joey, and unlike that traitorous scum at the beginning of the video, he doesn't attempt to steal my games or sell them on eBay, so we can't really argue with that too much. So this episode, what I wanted to do was think of a topic, something that would be a little bit longer than usual. So what I want to talk about is nostalgia, because I made a big point in previous videos about collecting games and it not necessarily being based on nostalgia and finding new games and that kind of thing. But what I want to do is go back through my old systems for the 512 subscriber special and just say what nostalgia I have for them, and a number of games that I had back in the day and I bought again recently or still got them and really enjoy, and what they mean to me now. So we'll start with the BBC. So this is my original BBC Model B, and this is the first computer that I ever used. So my father brought home 2 computers, and I remember this, I would have been about 3-4 years old at the time. He brought this BBC and this Texas TI-99 4A, which has got the proper keyboard rather than the chiclet one, and what he was doing was porting some software over from TI-99 Basic or TI Basic to BBC Basic, and the TI-99 didn't really get used in our household very much. It got used really for that one purpose, and we didn't really have many games on it. It does have a cartridge slot, and I remember borrowing some cartridges, a skiing game. Was it Horace Goes Skiing? Or was that a Spectrum game? I can't remember. But I used to play a few games on it, but it didn't really get used very much. But the BBC did quite a lot, and there were an awful lot of games that I had rather than bought on it. And one that I did buy towards the end was Repton Infinity. So Repton was a game that I really enjoyed, and I think the first one I played was Repton 3, and then I played 1 and 2, and I thought 2 was a bit odd. It's almost like a Metroidvania in the way that it plays, because it's based on one map. And for me, Repton was really my mascot character before Mario and Sonic really came along, although I think Mario probably was around at that point. But Repton was really good, but with this it was a bit disappointing, because I bought this from, it was probably a CVG advert, and this came mail order for the price of $14.95, which was quite expensive at the time, and it came on a bunch of discs, so you get 1, 2, 3, so it's got the data discs, game discs, data files and all sorts of stuff. And what this game really was, Repton Infinity, was, it was like a game maker that just happened to have a game in it, and I didn't find the game very good. I think at that age, I would have been probably about 8 years old, it was a bit too advanced for me, and I never really went back to it. But this is the only BBC game that I ever really bought, and it's the only one that I clearly still have, so this is my original copy. But Repton and the 8-bit era was really good. Okay, so the next machine that I had was an Atari ST. This isn't the original one, this was kindly donated by Dave Retro Rewind, and this is the STFM. Originally I had the Atari STE, and it was the one with the really dodgy BIOS in it, or the TOS system, the firmware, and it was really kind of flaky with certain games. So the games that I really liked from the ST era and the Amiga era as well, are these two, and these are my original copies. So these are a Turrican 1 and Turrican 2, and these are really, really good games, but it was awful because I played these on my friend's Amiga, and I got the games for the Atari ST, and it would crash randomly between about 10 minutes in and about 20 minutes into the game, and I could never finish the games because it would just lock up. And it was a real shame, and it was only years later through emulation that I really got to play the games properly, other than those few goes on an Amiga. But for me, I always had a real nostalgia for Turrican games. They were so good, and they still play well now, but I just couldn't play them. And I think the only... Well, no, I did get to play them a little bit through the Mega Drive. The Mega Drive port of the first game was okay, and the second one was Universal Soldier, which changed the formula a bit and took out the shoot 'em up, and it wasn't quite as good. But for me, nostalgia, the Atari and the Amiga, it's Turrican. Okay, so around 1990 I bought a Master System 2, just like this one. This has got Sonic included, but my original had Alex Kidd in Miracle World, which was a really good game. And before then, I didn't really see the point in consoles. A few of my friends had them, but having the Atari ST, I just didn't understand the point of having a computer without a keyboard. It seemed like a bizarre thing. But there was one game which really swung it for me, and that was Sonic. And that was clearly, and I suppose this one and the Mega Drive game, it was clear that there was a new era of games coming along with consoles, and I think they had the ability to supersede what was on the ST and the Amiga, which they ultimately did with, you know, the Mega Drive games and the Super Nintendo and everything since then. But Sonic I really enjoyed, and I bought the Master System really for that and Castle of Illusion. And both of these games are out on the Mega Drive. And I think my problem was, with the ST I was used to paying £10, £20 at most for games. We used to get a lot of them from Macro in Sheffield, and games were really cheap. But some of these games were 30 quid a pop, and it seems strange thinking about this so young. I would have been about 8 years old at the time, thinking, I'm getting ripped off here, these games are not worth it. So I sold my Master System to a friend of mine at school and got most of the money back for it, and I ended up buying a Mega Drive, which was a Model 1 like this one. It's a UK one that I had originally. This is a Japanese one, and later I got the Mega CD, but this is pretty much like what I had originally for the early 90s, I suppose, for about 3 years or so. So with the Mega Drive, thinking back to nostalgia and trying to pick a set of games for it, I'd have to say Sonic, because that was the game that convinced me to go for the Master System originally. And I played the Mega Drive game at a friend's house, and it was graphically a lot better than the Master System version. I do really like the Master System version, and I think games like that, Castle of Illusion, and even Wonder Boy 3, The Dragon's Trap, those games I played so much and really got, you know, my 30 quid's worth out of them. But I thought the rest of the Master System games didn't really justify the £30 price tag. So Sonic was the game that I got with the machine, and I think there would be very few people that don't have nostalgia for Sonic. It's such a good game. And I think Sonic 2 I bought a year later, and I wasn't quite as impressed with it. I know Sonic 2 is considered the best one in the series, but I prefer the first one and the third one, and Sonic & Knuckles, if you count that as like an add-on pack. But Sonic, for me, was the game that ushered in the era of consoles and convinced me that that was the way to go. So shortly after getting the machine, I bought World of Illusion. I'd never played Castle of Illusion on the Mega Drive, and I played it years later, and I did prefer that to World of Illusion. But I remember seeing this on a video from, I think it was Mean Machines, and it was like a beta, a prototype version of this game, and it looked really, really good. And when I played it, I mean, I can think of it now and think of all the times I really enjoyed playing the game, but I think if I go back to it now, I don't think it's aged quite as well. I mean, graphically it looks really nice, but I find the gameplay a little bit too slow and a little bit repetitive. And I think it's one of those games that you've got to really play at the time, whereas I think games like Castle of Illusion do age a lot better. So the other one from games that I owned back then was Virtua Racing, and this game was 70 quid at the time, and it was just too much. I would have been about 94, so I'd have been 12 at the time. I couldn't afford £70, playing a game. So what I did was rent it. I didn't rent very many games, but this was one that I did, and I mentioned this on earlier videos, that our video rental shop that did games wasn't open on a Sunday, so what I do is rent it for 2 days, rent it on the Friday, and then bring it back on the Monday. And Virtua Racing's such a short game that I think I rented it twice and finished it and got all the mirrored tracks and really enjoyed it. And this game's really cheap. If you buy it now from somewhere like eBay, it doesn't really carry much value. But I'd say if you've got Japanese Mega Drive, or you've got one that's switched to 60 Hz, get the Japanese version. And the reason is because some Mega Drive games won't play at 60 Hz. You've got the screen at the beginning, but you can fudge it if you flip the switch. Virtua Racing will not play at 60 Hz if you've got the PAL version. So the Japanese one, again, is really cheap on eBay, and I prefer it. I think it plays a little bit smoother just at having the 60 Hz. It seems a lot less jumpy and kind of choppy, which is the problem with the Mega Drive version. But again, I can't see someone who's not played the game back in the day really having an appreciation for it. For me, the nostalgia is playing a 3D game on the Mega Drive, and I played this in the arcades, and it would have been the arcade in Meadow Hall, and it was really one of the first 3D games that I played that ran at a decent speed. Would play games on the ST like Star Glider, but it didn't really, or even Resolution 101, but they didn't really have the number of polygons or the speed or the arcade factor that this did. And for me, this was a game that I wanted so badly, hadn't seen it in magazines for months and months and months, and just seeing that £70 price tag was such a disappointment. But as I say, with rental I got to play it. So the last few here for the Mega Drive are games that I didn't own but friends of mine did, and the first one was Strider. And Strider was really a game that, again with Sonic, really showed that you could have really good arcade quality conversions in the home. And it looks good even now. I mean, the size of the sprites on this game just are far better than anything you get on the ST and the Amiga. And it's hard. I mean, even as a kid I never finished the game, and I don't think I've ever finished it now. I get about halfway through, and it's just such a challenge. But I remember playing this again and again and again at friends, and we could never complete this game. It was just so difficult. The other one, the same guy had PGA Tour Golf. This is really good in multiplayer, and I've played the sequels. I've got a few down there, but the graphics got a little bit better, and in the case of 96 it's better 3D, although it's really slow to load. But for me, this is where the nostalgia sits, the hours we used to spend playing this game. And it was one of those ones that it's 3D, but we didn't care. Whereas Virtua Racing, it hits you in the face that it's 3D polygons. This is 3D polygons, but at that point we just didn't care. It was a golfing game. So for imports, this is probably the first Mega Drive shoot 'em up I ever played, and it happened to be an import. So another friend of mine from school had this, and he originally had a Japanese Mega Drive but sold it and got the UK one when he got the Mega CD, but he kept a few of his games. But I had a Game Genie, so what we used to do was loan the Game Genie, or I loaned it to him for a bit, and then he'd give it back to me and loan me some of his games, and one of them was Hellfire. And this is a really, really good game. It's hard, just like, Strider is a sign of the times of early Mega Drive games. They were really difficult. And again, this is based on an arcade game, but you've got the ability to take the ship and fire forward, backwards, up, down, or in a cross shape, or kind of tilted cross shape. And that game, for me, really, it's what I think of when I think of early Mega Drive shoot-em-ups, or that era of import games. Hellfire just sticks in my mind, and yeah, I played that quite a lot then and now. And the last one from the Mega Drive is Mega Bomberman. I didn't play this until probably 98, 99. This was when I was at sixth form, and in our common room someone brought in a Mega Drive, and the Mega Drive was dated at that point, but there were a few games that we used to play on it, and Mega Bomberman was one of them. And I remember reading about this in magazines, but for some reason I just thought it was a PC Engine game. I hadn't realised it had come out on the Mega Drive. I think I might have seen Super Bomberman 2 in a review for the SNES, but I'd never played it, and I really enjoyed this, and I bought the game back then, and I've still got that now. So this is almost like the second generation of Mega Drive, and as I've said many times, it was around that point where I bought a Mega Drive again and realised I was wrong to get rid of this machine in the first place, and that retro consoles really do have something to offer. So that really kicked off the emulation and having the real console, and over the 10 years since then I would flip back between the two before really settling on going for the real McCoy. So the last three games here for the Mega Drive, if you count it as a Mega Drive, are the Mega CD games, and two of these are shoot 'em ups. So you've got Sylpheed and Soulstar. And Sylpheed is a really good example of using full motion video in the background, and Soulstar is very much like a sprite scaling game. It's like Mode 7, but it's got sprite scaling. And for me, these were the two games that really justified having the Mega CD. Making good use of the CD-ROM drive for the graphics, and Soulstar making good use of the 3D. And again, like all these games, they're really hard, and I don't think I finished either of them at the time. I did later. Actually, have I finished this? I think I've only finished Soulstar, but they were really good games. And years later, I would look for sequels to Sylpheed, which came out, but nothing ever happened with Soulstar. There was never a sequel or anything like that. So the last one on the Mega CD is Ground Zero Texas. This is one that I've got to be careful about doing a gameplay of, because it's all technically a cutscene, because it's full motion video. And I think this was the one game that, was it Digital Pictures? Yeah, Digital Pictures that made this. They did Night Trap and a few others, and Sewer Shark and games like that. But there was Road Avenger, which is down there, and this one. But I think this is the game that really did the full motion video properly and made a decent game out of it. And it's bad. I mean, it's like a dodgy B-movie, but it all adds to the charm, and having the grainy video, which in this used Cinepak codec, so it was a little bit larger screen video. Did a really good job of it, and it's, yeah, again, it's one of those that I can't imagine anyone who hasn't played this back in the day enjoying now. But for me, it was one game when I got rid of the Mega CD. There was, these three I really didn't want to get rid of, because they were just, I suppose, groundbreaking at the time. And now you look back at them, they look a bit dated, but for me they just hold this nostalgia. Okay, change the memory card there, so on to part 2. So the next machine that I bought was a Jaguar, and then later the CD. I got the CD unit probably about 1998 from a cash converters in Barnsley for about 50 quid with 3 games, so that was a really good deal. I think they didn't know what it was worth. But I originally had the Jaguar, and as I say in this video, it's about nostalgia rather than quality. So the game that immediately comes to mind is Cybermorph, and this has got the Guro shading on it, and it was one of the first games to really do that, to have kind of non-flat polygons in an environment. So it did look better than a game like Virtua Racing. But looking at it now, the clipping on it's really bad, and like the draw distance, and the game really is quite limited. It was one of those early games where you've just got this environment, and it's more like a tech demo, and the game's kind of just built around it very loosely. And I think there were a lot of games like that on the Jaguar and the 3DO. They were really just tech demos, and the game was added very quickly at the end. But the second game, well, I suppose that came with it, but the first game that I bought was Alien vs Predator, and this was the game that really convinced me that the Jaguar was a good idea. And I would say that there are a handful of really good games on the Jaguar, and this is one of them. This is Alien vs Predator, and I first saw this on an episode of Games Master, and it looked really, really good. And looking at it now, it's really just Wolfenstein, but with textured floors and ceilings, and the engine's quite basic and it's a little bit slow, but it's one of the better Alien vs Predator games. And I think, you know, looking now at the Jaguar, it's way better than anything you get on a 16-bit console. So, as I say, with nostalgia, I finished this fairly quickly. It's a game where you could play as the alien, the predator, or the marine, and it's, yeah, really, really good game, and the amount of hours I put into that is silly. So almost contradicting myself with Cybermorph, this is Iron Soldier, and again it's one of those games where you've got this open world environment and you've got these mission objectives, but this was much more cohesive and it felt like a much better game. Again, it's texture mapped, actually it's not, I'm just looking at the screenshots now. I seem to remember it's texture mapped, it wasn't. Most of it was flat polygons like Virtual Racing, but there were the odd few bits here and there. I think it was the enemies that were texture mapped, but it was a really impressive game for the time. And there's a sequel on the Jaguar CD, which is really expensive. I remember them selling that in Telegames. And there's a sequel on the PS3, which was a Neon game, which I've not played, but it looks pretty good. So I think that might be one to see if I can get hold of at some point. Tempest 2000. So this is the last one I'll mention from the Jaguar. There's not much that needs to be said about this. This is a really good remake of the arcade game by Jeff Minter, and I loved this game when it came out, and I love it now. It's a really good reason to get hold of a Jaguar, although there is a Saturn version, but I'm not sure what that's like. I suspect it's just the same. So, after getting the Jaguar, I sold my Mega Drive and Mega CD, and I wanted to get a 3DO and then realised it cost too much. So I ended up buying a SNES, and then later the Saturn. So with the SNES, the games I got with it were Mario World, Mario All-Stars and Mario Kart, and they're quite expensive to get hold of. I've got Mario All-Stars, but the others are quite pricey, and I don't really see the point in picking those up, because you can get them on you know, so many other platforms. But the games that I'll mention here that I've got nostalgia for are Stunt Race FX. This was a really good use of the Super FX chip, and it looks a bit jerky now, and it's like Virtual Racing. It's aged not so well, but it's a good game, and a friend and I used to play so much on the game, do a 2-player on it, and you know, we complete all the different rounds. Yeah, it's a good game. I've got a lot of fun kind of memories of it. Donkey Kong Country. This really came out of me wanting a follow-up to Mario World, because Yoshi's Island took a long time to come out, and again, that's another game I've got a lot of nostalgia for. I don't have it on SNES, I've got it on the Game Boy Advance, but I'm not going to talk about handhelds on this. But Donkey Kong Country feels like almost like an evil twin to Mario World. It's got similar mechanics to it, and I think this, you know, tides me over quite well. I never got a chance to play games 2 and 3. I forget the specific titles of them, but they're fairly similar from what I understand to the first one. I think they're just a little bit harder. But the environments on Donkey Kong Country at the time, there was nothing else like it, and I think it's one of the few games that gets digitised sprites right. It doesn't look stuck on, because I'm not really a fan of them in things like shoot-em-ups. So the last one on the SNES is Return of the Jedi. This was a game that I borrowed when I originally had a SNES, and I remember at the time thinking, because the first level is the speeder across the sand, thinking this console, the SNES, and well, not even the Super FX, just the Mode 7, seemed to be better than the Mega CD, and I don't think it is, but just having the console on its own, and I've talked about this in a previous video, the SNES really is an impressive piece of hardware, and I think games like Return of the Jedi and the other Star Wars games really made good use of the hardware. So the original 2 games I didn't have access to or own back in the day, and I bought them years later and really enjoyed them, but this was the game that I played first, and it's a really good game. The soundtrack and graphics, it's just fantastic. And I've got a lot of fond memories of it. So after the SNES, I traded that in. So I had the SNES for about a year, I think about 18 months, and I played quite a lot of good games, and ones I don't currently have at the moment are games like Super Metroid and Mario Kart and Yoshi's Island, and those are really, really good games. But I played them and I got a bit bored of the SNES, so I ended up trading it in for the Saturn, and that it's this specific one. This is my original Saturn, so it's the original model with the kind of oval button, the black buttons rather than the circles, which is a real pig to mod. The original Saturn models are not so easy. But the original game I had on it was like a demo disc. It was a sampler. But the first game I bought was Sega Rally, and this was really, I've got mixed feelings about it because it was such a good game. It wasn't a launch game, but it was a fairly early game, and the Saturn, I think, peaked really early, and there were a load of really good first-party 3D titles. But after then, nothing else really seemed to push it that much further. There were the odd few games, but for the most part, third-party games weren't really up to the quality of the Sega ones. And I think the PlayStation kept going up in quality, whereas the Saturn kind of stayed at the same level. But this was a game that, just like Virtual Racing, played in the arcade, really wanted to play in the home. The next one is Exhumed. This is a game I don't really hear very much about, but this was programmed by Lobotomy, and this was a third-party game that really did make good use of the hardware in the Saturn. And graphically, it's pretty much like Quake, but with real-time lighting and almost a few things that you see in Quake 2. But the way it plays is very much like a Metroidvania. So you've got a kind of a map with multiple levels, and you go back and forth between them, and you get abilities like you can jump twice as high, or you can fly or swim underwater, and it opens up new areas of the game. So you've got to do a lot of backtracking, but it really feels a lot of fun, and it's just like Castlevania, but 3D. So another FPS is Space Hulk. Again, this is a game I don't really hear very much about. It's graphically very similar to Alien vs Predator, so everything's these flat corridors, everything's at 90 degrees, so it's really just a load of cubes. But what happens is when you're on these space hulks and you get close to the, what do they call them? They're not the Terminators. The Terminators are the knights that you play as. I forget the name of it. Gene Stealers. Already on the back of the box. But I don't know if you can tell, but you probably notice the quality of the Gene Stealers, which are these guys, is really, really good quality. And what happens is you're walking along and you can see these sprites, but when you get close it starts playing video, so it's almost like a QuickTime event, which is a little bit clunky but looked really impressive back then, because it'd be, you know, far better quality than you would get in a 3D model because it's all pre-rendered. But you've got these maps that you go into, and you've almost got a strategy. The levels aren't really that complex, and the missions are fairly similar, but you've got to control like a troop of different Terminators, the kind of like space marines in the future in the Warhammer universe, and you've got to position them in certain bits, and it's quite good. You've almost got like little sieges that go on. So last few for the Saturn are Street Fighter Alpha 2. I played the first one on a friend's PlayStation and I wasn't that impressed with it. My problem was I thought that Street Fighter 2 had so many versions and it had got so far developed that when the sort of sequel or prequel, which was Street Fighter Alpha or Zero, came out, it felt a little bit undercooked. But when this came out I was really, really impressed with it, and the Saturn version's a really good conversion. And there is a sequel which is Alpha 3, which did come out on the Saturn in Japan with the 4-meg cartridge, but I ended up getting that on the Dreamcast. But the amount of hours I put into this, just, you know, single and two player, really, really good game. So one of the later ones was Burning Rangers. This is one that I picked up when I first moved to Scarborough in 2000, and they had it in the market vaults for, I think it was about 10 quid. And this was a game that really got me back into the Saturn, because I'd bought the Dreamcast at that point. The Saturn wasn't getting used very much, but there were a few games like this that made me go back and get the machine out and really start playing it again. graphically it's impressive. There's a lot of lighting effects and things like that, and you play as a firefighter. But the game's very anime styled. It's made by Sonic Team, and it's a short game. And you've got four or five levels, but the game just feels really cohesive. Problem is, the graphics were really pushing the hardware too far, and it's a bit flaky and a bit glitchy in a few places, but it's a really good game, and it's one that if you've got Saturn and you can see this at a reasonable price, it's worth getting hold of. So the last one on the Saturn, and I'll group these together for nostalgia, are Knights and the 3D pad, because this was really one of the first analog pads. It wasn't the first one, but I preferred this far more to the N64 pad. I thought the controller in the middle was weird, and I think this was really pushing towards really the Xbox pad, because this was evolved into the Dreamcast controller, and then the Xbox pad added the second analog stick, which is why you've got this weird, with a DualShock on the PlayStation, both sticks are in the same place, but on the Xbox it's a little bit up, and I think it's just evolving from this. But having analog controls on games is really good. Games like even Sega Rally, because it sort of emulates the wheel, but Daytona USA, really good game to use it with. But Knights was one of those games that I'd read about it in magazines, and it almost seemed like a follow-up to Sonic that we never got on the Saturn. But you just play it, and the magic from playing Sonic, because I remember playing, I forgot to mention earlier, I played Sonic originally in a Comet on the Mega Drive, and I thought, I really want this game, and that magic was there in Knights, and it's a game that I don't come back to very much. There was a version on Xbox Live and PlayStation Network, and it's fairly close to the original. It's a really good game. I didn't like the Wii sequel though, that wasn't so good. So I'll include, for nostalgia, I didn't own a PlayStation originally. I'm not going to mention consoles after the Dreamcast, but I'll mention these two games, because I bought these before I bought a PlayStation. I used to emulate them on a PC, although it didn't run terribly well, were Ridge Racer and Ridge Racer Revolution, and these were games that I really enjoyed in the arcades, and owning a Saturn, I secretly envied PlayStation owners who had these games. I really wish they'd have come out on the Saturn, but Namco, for that point, were only supporting the PlayStation. Really good games, and they stand up well now. I think I prefer the original one, because that was the one that I played more in the arcades. Okay, so the last console that I'll mention is the Dreamcast, and this is a machine that I've got a lot of fondness for kind of two reasons. One's the game, the other one, as you'll probably see sticking out the back, is my SD adapter, and this is the machine that I used to develop kind of homebrew games on. And originally I used to use one of these, which is a coder's cable that I bought from some seller in the UK. I don't think they were allowed to sell them on eBay for some reason, back in 2000, and it was great because you could develop software on the PC and then run a boot disk and, you know, kind of squirt the code over to the Dreamcast. But having one of these SD readers is so much better. But kind of homebrew aside, the Dreamcast was really was a shame. It was such a good machine, and it was Sega getting things right, because I think the Saturn, some of the stronger games were the 2D games, and I think the Dreamcast has got some really good 2D titles on it. And the one that I really wanted on the Saturn was Street Fighter Alpha 3 and those kind of games, and Marvel vs. Capcom, but that ended up coming out on Dreamcast. But I really bought this originally just to play these arcade kind of 2D fighting games, and you've got that and the Japanese Capcom vs. SNK and SNK 2. And I don't know, I think the Dreamcast is kind of this magical mixture of arcade games and advanced, almost like PlayStation 1 N64 era games. I don't think the Dreamcast is as powerful as the PS2, and particularly the later games, but there were these early games like Sonic Adventure. So this is the original copy, which is from Cash Converters. The graphics were quite simple, but they were really clean, and I remember playing this and thinking, Sega really has got it right, and I can see why Sonic Adventure didn't come out on a machine like the Saturn, because the Dreamcast was that little bit more powerful, and it was starting to open up these environments, and you weren't just running down corridors anymore, you were starting to get these open worlds. I mean, it's not anything like, you know, Morrowind or Skyrim, but it was the start of it, and for me, Sonic Adventure was the 3D Sonic game that I enjoyed the most. The later ones I didn't enjoy quite so much, but this, hours I used to put into it, and I played it through with Sonic, Tails, Knuckles. There were a few others. There was one called Big the Cat. I don't remember much about, other than you had to do a kind of fishing game. The next one's Tokyo Highway Challenge. This really is a game you don't really get very much now. There was a whole series of them, and they started off as Shidoko Battle on the SNES. Then there was a Saturn and PlayStation game, and Dreamcast, PS2, and then there was one on the Xbox. But I really enjoy this one. It's got terrible handling on it, but you're driving really just around this loop in Tokyo, and you've got to race or challenge other cars, and you get points for doing it. So you flash your lights and then you race them, and you've got like a bar, almost like a health bar, like Street Fighter. And it was just the smoothness of it. I mean, graphically it's not that detailed, but having these really kind of, not just smooth geometry, but having 60 frames a second really showed that the Dreamcast was you know, an upcoming machine. MSR, Metropolis Street Racer. This really was a good example of a next-gen game, and the handling on it's really good. I think it's dated a little bit now, but I preferred this to the original Project Gotham. I thought the handling, they changed it a little bit, and I thought the second Project Gotham handled more like this. But this was a game that I just put hours and hours and hours into it when I was at uni, instead of kind of as a procrastination activity. But I really, really enjoyed it, and the motto of it is, it's not how fast you drive, it's how you drive fast. And it kind of encourages you to drive around these realistic cities and use the handbrake on corners, which you can't really do on a game like Gran Turismo. So we've got Marvel vs. Capcom 2, which I should have mentioned earlier. That was the last one we got in this series, I think, until a couple of years ago when Street Fighter 4 and the Marvel vs. Capcom 3 game came out. This got a lot of ports on different machines, but this is the one I originally played, and just having the roster of characters, and it's almost like the games that I used to read about on the Saturn, which I ended up, you know, picking up later on import. But this was the most mature version of them. So you had the X-Men, Children of the Atom, the Street Fighter games, X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Marvel Superheroes, Superheroes versus Street Fighter, the Marvel Capcom, and this one. And this was really good game. Just the roster of characters and unlocking them, hours I used to spend on that. So the last couple are, one is Phantasy Star Online. It's dated a little bit in the way that it plays. It's very slow, and the attacks are very kind of predefined. There's only a couple of different attacks, but that's probably due to it using a 56k modem if you were lucky. But I remember playing this and doing something a bit naughty, because you used to have to use the BT service provider with the Dreamcast. It was locked to it. But if you had an American import game and an import CD, you could change the number. So I had like an Anytime account, so I changed the number in the Dreamcast to use the Anytime account, and as long as I used it after 6 o'clock, it didn't cost me anything. So I used to just spend hours and hours on this without the worry that it was going to cost money to play. I think the American version, it's not locked to the service provider, but I think you had to pay a subscription. I might be wrong, but the UK one, the subscription was really through the service provider. But you know, it was expensive back then in 2001 to just be on the internet all day. So you know, I did that for a bit and then just played it for free. Oops. So the last one for nostalgia is Shenmue. So I bought Shenmue 1 as soon as it came out, and then Shenmue 2, but I've played this one more. The Shenmue 2 I've only played through once, but this is a game that I really enjoyed. I found it more detailed. I think Shenmue 2 was a bigger map, but because they had to kind of pad out the game a little bit because of it being so many episodes. There's a lot more detail in it, and having the arcade in it and playing the Saturn game. No, they were arcade games. Sorry, I was thinking the Saturn conversions. They weren't. They were the arcade ones of the Outrun and Afterburner, and having just all the detail in the shop. Oh, yeah, I really should play this again. It's one of those games that I think really paved the way for games like Grand Theft Auto, these open world games, and just having a storyline. It seemed like the way that point and click roleplay games, not roleplay, adventure games rather, things like Monkey Island, the Scum VM games, really were kind of evolving, and I think this was a good example of that. So I think I'll leave it there. I've waffled on far too long about nostalgia, and really, as this is the 512 subscriber special, I just want to say thanks to everyone who's stuck with me for the last, it's coming up to 2 years now, and I've slowed down a little bit making videos, and I think that's just due to time and availability rather than, you know, enthusiasm. There's still a lot more games that I want to do gameplays of, and, you know, keep doing the weekend waffles. I've got quite a few ideas, it's just getting the time to do it. So I'd just like to thank all the subscribers that have stuck with me for so long, and thanks for all the comments and discussion. So I'd like to open this video up and ask if anyone wants to do a video response on nostalgia and games that mean a lot to them from their childhood, or, you know, people that are older, from in their early 20s. That'd be great. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for watching.